You are on the deck of a fishing trawler at 4 in the morning, out past the point where the water turns the colour of old iron, somewhere in the North Sea between England and the Netherlands. The net comes up dripping, and the crew sorts through the usual mess: the eels, the seaweed, the grey fish nobody wants. And then one of them stops. There is a bone in the net. It is thick, curved, too heavy to be a cow, and it has been underwater longer than anyone on the boat has been alive. The captain holds it up to the pale deck light. It is part of the jaw of a mammoth, and this is not a one-off. Trawlers working the North Sea have pulled up mammoth teeth, woolly rhinoceros tusks, primitive flint tools, chunks of ancient forest peat, and in one famous case a Mesolithic harpoon carved from antler, all of it dragged off the seafloor by a net that was meant for fish. The North Sea floor is not empty. It has a horizon. There is a country down there, and it is full of bones. What was it like to live there? We grow up with maps that show Britain as an island, a chunk of land permanently cut off from the continent by water. The Channel separates it from France. The North Sea separates it from Scandinavia. It feels like geography, like something that has always been true, as fixed as the mountains on a school atlas. But here is the thing those maps never tell you. 12,000 years ago, there was no channel, and the North Sea, as we understand it, barely existed. The whole stretch of water between Britain and mainland Europe was dry land, a vast, rolling, low-lying plain that connected England to the Netherlands, to Denmark, to northern Germany, a territory larger than many modern countries. And it wasn't empty wilderness. It was home to thousands of people. They hunted across it, fished its rivers, camped along its lakes, and buried their dead in its soil. And then the sea rose and swallowed it, slowly over thousands of years, piece by piece, until the people who lived there had to decide whether to leave or drown or be pushed out of their own homes by the tide itself. By the end of this video, you will never look at a map of the North Sea the same way again. You'll look at that grey water and see a sunken world underneath it, an entire lost landscape that archaeologists call Doggerland. A land bigger than some countries that was flooded out of existence in broad daylight over centuries, while the people who lived on it could only watch the water come. And I am going to show you how we know it was there, how it died, why its story was preserved instead of erased, and what it tells us about a future that might be coming for our own coastlines right now. Here is the strange beginning of the whole discovery. It starts with fishing, pure and simple. For well over a century, North Sea trawlers have been hauling up things that have no business in a fishing net, and the fishermen kept the strange stuff out of curiosity, partly because some of it was worth money. Mammoth bones, the great curved tusks of woolly rhinoceros, flint blades with a human edge, and in one famous case, in 1931, off a sandbank called the Lemon and Hour Banks, a beautifully carved antler harpoon came up, with barbs cut into it, the kind of tool a hunter would use to spear fish in the shallows. That harpoon shook the archaeologists who saw it, because it was unmistakably the work of human hands, Mesolithic hands, and it had come from the bottom of the sea, miles from the nearest coast. It was the first hard proof, found by accident, that people had once lived on land that is now underwater. In a real sense, a fisherman's net discovered an entire lost country. What else does that water hide? Archaeologists needed a name, and a British scholar named Brian E. Coles coined one in the 1990s, drawing together all the scattered evidence in a careful survey. She called it Doggerland after the Dogger Bank, the great shallow ridge in the middle of the North Sea, itself named by old Dutch fishermen after a sailing boat called a dogger. So the name is a fisherman, S-word wrapped around a lost hunter, S-world, which feels exactly right, since it was fishermen who first proved the place existed. Here is what the flood kept for us. In the early Holocene, after the last great ice age ended. But before the seas finished rising, the North Sea basin was a kind of northern European paradise. Can you picture it? The glaciers had retreated, and they left behind rich, fertile lowlands, crossed by rivers that are still there, still running, still carving their channels under the water we sail on today. The Rhine and the Thames, the Elbe and the Meuse, all of them flowed together into one enormous river system. On that plain, a vast network of channels, lakes, and marshlands that would have been spectacular hunting and fishing country. On that land lived Mesolithic people, hunter-gatherers who followed the herds, fished the streams, made tools from antler and flint, and probably moved with the seasons the way their ancestors always had. They built their fires on those banks, skinned their kills on those meadows, and watched their children learn to swim in those lakes. They did not know they were living on land that was about to disappear. Now, to understand how it disappeared, you have to understand that the sea did not rise all at once, and it did not rise in a smooth, gentle, even curve. It rose in pulses, in surges, in a long, irregular march. And the story of Doggerland's death is really the story of a coastline running backward for thousands of years. At first, the rise was slow, a few millimeters a year, and for a while people simply adapted, moving their camps slightly inland over the generations, probably barely noticing the change within a single human lifetime. Because a few millimeters a year is nothing you can feel. But the water never stopped. Every century the coast crept inland, the rivers got longer, the lakes got bigger, and the richest hunting grounds, the ones closest to the old coast, were swallowed first. What do you do when your home starts to disappear? And there is a second force at work in that story that you should know about, because it complicates the simple picture of water just rising everywhere. While the oceans were climbing from the melting ice, the land itself was also changing, shifting like a slow-breathing animal. The great ice sheets had been enormously heavy, and while they were there, they pressed the land beneath them down. When the ice melted away, the land began to rebound upward again, like a cushion springing back, a process geologists call isostatic rebound. So in some places, the land was rising even as the sea was rising, and in other places, the land was sinking, and the two forces fought each other for control of the coastline. This is why the flooding of Doggerland was not a uniform, predictable event, but a mess of local battles, some places flooding fast, some slow, some temporarily spared, which makes the story of the people who lived there even more complicated, because they could count on the water behaving in any consistent way. The last chapter of the drowning is where it stopped being gradual, around 6,000 years ago, more or less, the final low ridge of land that connected Britain to the continent. What geologists sometimes call the land bridge, finally went under for good. After that, Britain was an island cut off, no longer reachable on foot from Europe, and the last people still living on the highest remaining bits of Doggerland had a choice: board the boats that were left and trust the water, or stay and watch the tide climb over their camps. Most of them, presumably, did what every coastal people does when the sea takes their land. They packed up, got into boats, and sailed away from the drowning country, carrying whatever they could, leaving the rest for the water, and then the sea closed over it entirely, and for 8,000 years the whole world forgot that a country had ever been there. Forgotten, except for the moment a fisher, Snet, came up heavy, with a bone that didn't belong in the water. So the water rose and erased a country. But here is what makes Doggerland such a haunting story, and what separates it from an ordinary flood in the history books. It didn't happen in a day, and it didn't happen on a date you could circle on a calendar. It happened over centuries to real families who watched their world shrink one flood at a time. If you were born on Doggerland, you would have grown up hearing your grandparents tell stories about fields and rivers that, by your childhood, were already seabed. You would have watched the marsh creep closer with every passing season, seen the fishing grounds shift, seen the landmarks your parents knew sink below the surface, and you would have had to decide, at some point, whether your children would grow up on the shrinking land or learn to live on the water. The drowning wasn't a single catastrophic night, though there may have been terrible hours. It was a slow, grinding, generational retreat, and that makes it feel less like a tragedy and more like a disappearance, a whole culture quietly walking away from its own home, one family at a time, until the last family walked away and there was nobody left to tell the story. And there is one event in the story that deserves special attention, because it is the moment when the water didn't just rise, it attacked. Geologists have found the traces of a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, a collapse of the seafloor called the Stoggerslide that triggered a giant tsunami around 8,000 years ago. The wave hit the coasts of Norway, Scotland, and England with terrifying force. And it didn't just flood the lowlands, it slammed into them. You can still find the signature of that tsunami buried in sediment along these coasts today. A sudden layer of sand, dumped by a wall of water that arrived in minutes and rearranged the landscape in hours. For any of the people of early Doggerland who were still living close to the shore, that one event would have been a turning point. The moment the sea stopped being a slow, patient thief and showed the people on the land exactly what it was capable of when it decided to move quickly. Some researchers think that tsunami and the fear it created may have been one of the reasons people finally abandoned the last remaining low-lying areas for good. Now, here is the part that should really get to you, because the mapping of Doggerland is not finished, and it is getting more detailed all the time. Archaeologists have spent the last couple of decades scanning the North Sea floor with sonar, seismic imaging, and sediment coring, building a picture of the sunken landscape that sharpens with every year of work. They have traced the old river valleys, mapped the ancient forests, and found what appear to be settlement sites, whole Mesolithic home bases sitting there under the water, preserved in mud. In 2020, researchers announced the discovery of what looked like a Stone Age settlement site on the North Sea floor, a place where people once made their homes, now buried under tens of meters of water and sediment. The large European research project driving much of this work, called Europe's Lost Frontiers, has been systematically mapping the submerged landscape, and the results are genuinely eerie. A detailed map of rivers, forests, and camps that people walked across 8,000 years ago, and that no human has walked across since. That mapping project is anchored by a team built around the archaeologist Gaffney at the University of Bradford, who has spent his whole career arguing that we have only the haziest idea of what prehistoric Europe was really like, precisely because the sea took so much of it. And his point, which is a good one, is one you should sit with for a second. The modern map of Europe is a map of survivors. It is a map drawn after the water rose and ate the coastlines. A map of the land that happened to be high enough to escape the flood. Everything below that line, an enormous chunk of the prehistoric world, including some of the richest, most habitable land of its time, is simply missing from the record. For most of the ancient past, we have been reading the history of a continent while cheerfully ignoring the half of it that is sitting underwater. And here is a strange, almost poetic twist. The reason we know about Doggerland, the reason the mammoth bones and that harpoon survive, is precisely because the land was drowned. The tools and bones were buried, sealed underwater, cut off from air and scavengers. If the sea had never risen, Doggerland's archaeology would almost certainly be scattered and lost, ploughed under by fields, built over by cities. Isn't that a strange kind of mercy? Instead, the very flood that destroyed the country also preserved its memory, like a museum that burglarized itself, took its own treasures, and hid them underwater for 8,000 years, only for them to be given back, one bone at a time, in the nets of fishermen who never asked to be archaeologists. Now, here is where the story turns toward you. Doggerland is not just a fascinating story about the past. It is a warning. It is a rehearsal. Does any of this feel familiar? The sea rose and drowned an entire country, not because of a single storm, not because of any one disaster, but because the climate warmed, the ice melted, and the water climbed, slowly, relentlessly, exactly the way scientists say it can climb again today. And it happened in a way that is uncomfortably familiar to people who could not stop it, who could only watch it come, move inland, watch it come again, move again, generation after generation, until there was nowhere left to move that wasn't already claimed by the tide. Read The Archaeology of Doggerland, and you are reading a field guide to what happens to a coastal civilization that cannot or will not outrun its own rising sea. And there is a final, quieter lesson in it, the one I actually want you to keep. The people of Doggerland did not get a dramatic ending. There was no plaque, no monument, no single moment of disaster that marked the last time anyone walked that land. They got the stranger, sadder fate of watching the edge of their world turn to water and deciding, one family at a time, to walk away from their own home and trust the ocean to give them something else, or simply to accept that the life they'd known was over, that their children would grow up somewhere their grandparents never imagined. But before we let the water close over it, stand with me for one moment on the highest point that was left. Imagine a ridge of high ground. What would one day be the Dogger Bank, rising above the plain, like a low green swell of hill country. From the top of it, in the last generations, you could look out across a world that was already half water, a patchwork of shrinking dry land, brackish lagoons, drowned meadows with the pale tops of old tree stumps sticking up through the shallows. Out to the east, the rivers that had once run clean to a distant coast now widened into grey miles of sea. And yet, on that high ridge, there was still life. Herds still grazed on the last dry pasture. Hunters still worked their flint beside the marsh. Children still waded after eels in the warm shallows, unaware that the water at their ankles had a schedule. It is one of the most quietly devastating images archaeology can give us, a whole people living on the last island of their own country, going about ordinary days while all around them the world they inherited quietly drowned. And here is a strange, unclassifiable tangent that has always stuck with me. That same stretch of shallow, treacherous sea, the Dogger Bank, would one day be the site of a completely different kind of human drama. A full naval battle in the First World War, fought in the North Sea in January of 1915 between the British and German fleets, remembered today mostly because it was a mess of smoke, low visibility, and miscommunication. The kind of fight where the fog did more damage than the guns ever did. The name Dogger, remember, came from the little Dutch fishing boats that once worked those waters. So here you have one submerged name carrying 2,000 years, weight of human history. A fishing boat, a drowned hunter's country, a 20th century battle, all sitting on top of each other in the same patch of grey water. There is no clean moral to that. It is just proof that the North Sea has been a stage for human business far longer than our maps admit, and that the same few square miles of it have witnessed people flee a rising tide, haul up fish, and blast each other with battleship guns. In no particular order, there is another echo worth chasing too, because it reaches all the way into the stories we still tell ourselves. Think about how many ancient cultures from the Middle East to the Pacific Islands, to indigenous Australia, carry some version of a great flood, a deluge that drowned the old world and left a handful of survivors to start again. For a long time, scholars treated these as separate, unconnected myths, coincidence, or symbolism, or shared storytelling. But a growing number of researchers now think at least some of those flood stories may carry a kernel of real memory, passed down over many generations, of the actual flooding that followed the last ice age, when the sea really did swallow enormous stretches of low-lying land, when whole territories really did turn to water within the lifetime of a family's remembered history. Doggerland may be one of the strongest candidates for that, a genuine drowned homeland, and it is not hard to imagine its last refugees carrying the story of a lost country into Europe, and in time, into legend, the mythic flood. If you buy that reading, is not just a story about divine anger, it is partly a story about real ancestors who watched the sea take everything and tried, in the only way they knew, to make sure nobody forgot, So the next time you look at a map, or fly over the channel, or stand on a beach that used to be miles inland, remember what is underneath the grey water: a field of mammoth bones, a forest of ancient oak, a river valley where people fished and raised their children, and the memory of a country that the sea folded under the map, not in a single night, but in the slow, inexorable rising of the tide, doing exactly what water does when you give it time. And if that sounds like a story that belongs only to the past, to a drowned country nobody remembers, ask yourself a simpler question the next time you hear about rising seas and coastal cities and flood warnings that keep getting worse. The water that buried Doggerland is still rising. It never really stopped. We are all, in a sense, the people standing on the shrinking land, deciding whether there is still time to move, or whether we be the next civilization that the sea quietly, patiently folds under the map. The country is underwater. The future hasn't been written yet.